So good evening, Dr. McCullough. It's been great working with you during my time here at the PRBA. And as you know, we have been working on trying to collect some oral histories around the founding of the PRBA, but also around your own particular experiences at the PRBA and the kinds of contributions that you've made. So how about you take us back to the very beginning, the pre-beginning, and tell us a little bit about the PRBA.
Well, I'm personally thrilled about the opportunity to kind of describe my background and the fit with the PRBA. I actually started as an undergrad with the clear intent of being a biochemist, and it was actually through a series of events in experiencing psychology and the social environment that led me to be a social psychologist. While I was training as an undergraduate, I actually had the opportunity to take a number of social psych courses, one of which was by Steve Kleinberg, Otto Kleinberg's son. And there's a phrase which he used that was, each of us starts with the capacity to lead any of 1,000 different lives, and we end up only leading one of them. And that really stuck with me 45 years later, and actually helped me to focus in on a range of individual circumstances that affect the lives of many different types of individuals. So as an undergraduate, one of the things that I was particularly interested in was psychology, even though I had started off in psychology training rats, and my biochemistry was actually still there because I started off trying to understand the effects of caffeine on this behavior.
What year around was this, roughly?
This was roughly 1969, 1970. So it was kind of the fall into the early year of 1970. So kind of psychology as a natural science, which is where I was oriented, kind of behavior. And in fact, you know, one of the people who I worked under there, not worked under, but I came to know quite strongly, the chairman of the department at that point was Leo Kamen. And Leo, of course, was one of the first people to start the refutation of Herrnstein's arguments around the inheritability of intelligence. So it was actually a very good heady time. And I ended up doing a lot of, I was really being trained as an experimental social psychologist. I did a lot of laboratory work for people like John Darley, Joel Cooper, Mark Zanna, and I actually helped to run some of the bystander intervention experiments as a result of the early work that John Darley and Bibb Latney had done around bystander intervention. So that's where I started, but I was very active as a undergraduate in psychology. In fact, I found an old piece here, and I founded an organization called BSM, which was Black Psychology Majors. And this was a mimeograph sheet that I produced, and on the front of the mimeograph it says, as stated before, I'm compiling a little booklet of information on us that might be of some assistance for both ourselves and speakers we might bring in. I actually got going a speaker series to bring in black speakers to Princeton. We had one black faculty member, Bill, blanking on his name. We also had another Bill Cross, who was at that point a graduate student. But we brought in speakers.
William?
Yeah, yep, William E. Cross as a graduate student. And we brought in lots of people like the McAdoos. John and Harriet McAdoo came in, brought in Curtis Banks, and lots of these people we brought in as speakers. And as it turns out, I guess I was kind of being used in the sense that they used that visit to recruit Curtis Banks to the faculty. So he was there as well as with ETS. But as a result of these kind of efforts, compiled information, and it goes on to read, the information I need is hometown, interest areas, research area, and future plans. For example, one might read, name, Wayne McCullough, hometown, Youngstown, Ohio. Interest areas, person, perception, attribution theory, self-concept, Black identity and motivation. Future intention, graduate study and work in clinical settings with emphasis on Black identity and motivation. So a little bit more information, but I had a number of people who actually returned these, and 'cause at the end I says, so by Wednesday, November 22nd, fill in the information on the bottom of this sheet or the back and place in my box. Otherwise, I'll be on your backs. And a number of folks here, one said, no thanks, over, and she filled it out, and lots of very helpful information. So it's been a while since I've looked at these, but very good stuff. And a number of these people talked about going on to graduate school, and some of them are named professors at this point. So it was actually in the fall of 1970 that I actually embarked upon my career as a survey researcher. So if you count the years, it's been almost 44 years I've been doing survey research. I conducted a study. I was really interested in why Black freshmen at Princeton were actually attriting at higher levels than their white counterparts. So one of the things I did was I adapted a questionnaire by John Centra, who was at ETS at that point, and administered this to a group of incoming freshmen in the fall of 1970. I had a high level of participation in that. I had about 35, 40 freshmen who filled it out not only when they first arrived, I hunted them down, and I re-administered that just before Christmas, and then I re-administered that again just before the end of the year in April. So unknowingly, I was actually doing a design of kind of within subjects, the comparison of changes over time. I did not have, and this was in a sense a presage to work in the National Survey of Black Americans, I did not have a white control group. And so these were data that I actually collected. And unfortunately, there weren't people on the faculty at that point who could really, help me with the analysis. So I still have those data in the basement that I will one day actually come back to and actually analyze and present. But finished at Princeton, degree in psychology, as well as a teaching certificate in secondary social studies, and was ready for graduate school. Entered the University of Michigan in the fall of 1973, and actually had a very positive experience in that there were a large number of Black graduate students. I think we may have had 12 across the various subdisciplines of psychology who entered that fall, and many of whom are still very good friends today. But we started off our initial meeting in 6050 of ISR. Social psych program was housed there, and we started off. I personally, is probably demonstrated by my undergraduate experience, was kind of blazing a personal path into this, and not knowing that I was actually doing it. But soon after I got there, I did a validation study for Marty Gold on interviewing adolescents on drug use and other kinds of behavior. And so it was a validation study, and I trained in interviewing and did a number of interviews in the local area. And the beginning of that next year, I actually was an assistant study director at ISR, where I was one of two working with Jerry Johnston, and we did a participant observation study of minority youth in the Youth Conservation Corps. Had 3 observers who actually traveled around the country into the camps and wrote up reports. Hal Fairchild was one of those parties, Jackie Beal, and a Hispanic woman. So we actually had a very good time in doing that, very important work. So as things were progressing, I also had an organizational bent to my training. I spent the summer at the Center for Creative Leadership in the mid-'70s as a summer fellow, actually doing performance appraisal work, training, and also taking that into various companies. And then coming in off of that, I did a study, actually 2 different studies. One, I worked for about a year on the School of Education on a demonstration project for the Department of Education on trying to take a look at disproportionate disciplinary practices in a range of school systems in Michigan: Jackson, Detroit, Highland Park, Lansing, and so on, and trying to understand why black kids were being so highly disciplined when their white counterparts were not. But also then did another piece of survey research with Pat Gurin. We surveyed all of the counseling agencies on campus, not only the agencies, but what services they provided, but also the subset of students in terms of what services they actually were aware of and what services they utilize. So really to try and rationalize that system of counseling services on campus. So this was just all of a kind of a presage to my joining the National Survey of Black Americans in the 1977. And kind of the early days as a run-up, we were doing a lot of work in constructing the questionnaires, a lot of pre-testing and back translation, and again and again. Because of my background, one of the pieces I actually helped construct for the study was the interviewer training program. And that training program, I actually have some documents here that detail that, in the sense that this is a memo to the NSBA traveling training team members, dated April 11th, 1979, just going through what we're supposed to be evaluating and how the training was going to be conducted. The whole notion about demonstrating and practice interviews, demonstrating those practice interviews and in a round robin sense. We actually gave them sampling homework because we were so far away from the 1970 census. We actually had to go out and really list all of the households within the sample frame, and to understand who lived there and so on. So we used WASP techniques, et cetera. And then through that scouting and listing exercise, we had to take the interviews actually out into the field to demonstrate this. And so it was a very exhaustive process. Again, training more than 500 interviewers nationally, and having to go to some of these venues a couple of times because of interviewer attrition. But the other thing I have here is the manual of the schedule of training, which I developed, day 1 through day 5. It was a 5-day intensive training, and we actually went into the 6th day, and sometimes even to a 7th. So, and we paid the interviewers for their participation, but it was very intense. And on the schedule that we had for this one, which was Atlanta, I gave the intro, then James introduced the staff and information about the University of Michigan and ISR. Shirley Hatchett described the interviewer's role, and then I started the process and for the role playing around interviewing. Shirley came back with that, and Woody was involved in that one. And so, yeah, it was a process. And again, between 5 and 7 days, depending upon whether this was an initial training or whether it was one of the follow-ons. So, very intense stuff. So we actually did that work, and as we got toward the end of the study, I just wanted to share with you that we had T-shirts that were developed, and some of them were personalized, as you will see, and you may look at that and say, he can't fit in it, but I actually do still fit in that T-shirt. And in fact, I'm going to be making more of these and selling these on eBay as originals. We did a lot of work through that time because mine was the first dissertation that was actually started on that. And so I actually have a memo that I wrote to my dissertation committee, which was James, Jerry, Pat, and Phil. And this one was dated December 2nd of 1980. And so I was giving the background on what I intended to do, how it was going to be conducted. I even had my little path diagram about the impact of the variables on that. It was broken out further in terms of the path diagram. Even had tables in terms of the distribution because it was on the...
All typed up.
That's the way I roll. And then the other thing is that in this process, because of the work with Pat, because it was really through Pat and Jerry that many of the identity questions were constructed as they were, because I wrote the group identity, racial identity questions for the questionnaire. And so much of that was really around the notion of the degree to which individuals, and it's the IE, so the Rotter IE, and internal external locus of control. And one of the things I did throughout the dissertation is to really take a look at things like individual coping, things around the group level, system attitudes, and as well as intergroup interaction, because there were hypotheses generated really about how individuals were going to deal with intergroup conflict based upon the kind of environments from which they came from. So very helpful, exhaustive work that was done, and I even had, because a lot of open ends, have the original coding sheets.
Wow.
That were done by my coders. I paid them. I'm not sure whose funds I used.
So just for a point of clarification, just so I'm at the right point in the story. So you've transitioned to Michigan, you've been involved in various research activities coming up into the NSBA.
Yep.
For the NSBA, you worked with the training of interviewers in all the different cities, and then you, in terms of the questions that were on the survey, you focused in on the racial identity questions. Just stop me when I've gone wrong, and then also you wrote your dissertation when the study was done, or what I'm trying to get clear on, did you write, was your dissertation also on the interview trainings? Or
No.
was it only on the, okay.
It was on the racial identity. So many of us had sections that we were actually honchoing. Woody was really around the mental health. The section I had was around racial identity, right? Okay. That was, my authorship, working with, of course, lots of others. But then there were things in terms of the study itself. So I actually did responsibility for the interviewer training. So I wrote the original plan for that. And so it was a combination of that process and these racial social identity questions on which I wrote the dissertation. So And again, the original questionnaire from which all of this came. And, I'm not sure the youth of today would understand how you put together one by cutting and pasting and moving this stuff around. It was a real task, but yes, that was the original one that I used. And yeah, excellent stuff. And so this also represents an original data. You don't even know what a data tape is, do you? You know what a data tape is? Okay. You probably have more memory on your phone than really is on this tape. Sure. But this contains an original abstraction of the NSBA data set, and those variables coded very specifically for the socialization. So.
Wow. So on this tape, you have the brief, open-ended responses.
The coded responses, yes.
The coded. Wow.
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's pretty heavy. Yeah.
So, there are a lot of these kind of artifacts that exist from a time that was very storied. I'll just show just a couple other things here, which are important. So you don't even know about computer paper being this wide. This used to be called watermelon paper because the green stripes used to be more prominent. But again, this was the output that we had, and this was just listing of the variables and some of the initial tests. So yeah.
Wow. And so this is the output. So you would go up to one of those big IBM machines and wait a few days.
No, it wasn't a few days. It was actually going up and running your cards. But this was, at this point, it was more advanced because we had data tapes. So we could actually run Midas, or at the point at which we were actually doing this study, we had Osiris. Osiris was actually a far superior program at that point to SAS or SPSS. And in fact, when I left, and then I'll come back, but when I left, I actually, this is Micro Osiris. So this was the desktop version of that, which I also took to IBM. So I took both the Major Osiris, the mainframe version, as well as Micro Osiris. And the only reason why this didn't do better, because it really should have been the preeminent software analysis program, is marketing. And there was no marketing from the perspective of
so at that
ISR.
time we had SPSS and SAS as developing.
I'm not even sure SAS was developing at that point. There may have been a very small kind of, I'll call it more kernels around the SPSS, but the big dogs were really Osiris.
Interesting.
And not only Osiris, but you had other very specialized programs that were written by places like the Army and so on. And but Osiris was really the big dog. But again, getting very nice output. This was analysis of variance of outgroup orientation by socialization messages. So
what's funny is it's amazing how similar those tables look to the tables that come out of SPSS today. They look a lot like that.
Like I said, that one should still be around, but they were just emulating. So those very early days were actually very strong, and we didn't realize it at that point about what was being built, because the National Survey of Black Americans, given the large number of interviews that we conducted in the cross-section and the 3-generational sample, really served as the basis for so much work that came after. And the process that we employed in getting the study to field was very unique and different, and called upon very unique talents from a range of people who may not have realized those were talents they had. So it was a very heady time, and we enjoyed it. We worked very, very hard, oftentimes well into the night, and sometimes we partied well into the night. But that was the nature of the times, and thoroughly enjoyed it. I should note that after the data came out of the field, and I was trying to fairly quickly work on the dissertation, I assembled, as should have been suggested to people had they known me in my undergraduate days, that I was going to mobilize graduate students to get things done. So we actually had a group of graduate students who were a couple years behind me. I stayed there longer than I should have, but because I originally had a dissertation proposal off of a different data set, but was convinced that the National Survey of Black Americans would actually provide superior data. And so I stayed the course to actually do that. But so the other graduate students who I convinced that we need to get on with this and get done were people like Linda Chatters and Rob Taylor and Woody Neighbors and a few others who were there.
And they were all in the psychology program at the time.
They were all in, with the exception of Taylor, who was in the combined program.
Okay.
So yes, most of the students certainly working around ISR came out of psychology. A few, like Robert, came from other places. So yeah.
Okay. So so from what I know, correct me when I'm wrong, after the study goes to field, people get the data, they're analyzing it. Many of the people who worked on the study go in different directions, right? So you're one of the people who decided not to stay in academia and decided to kind of branch out. So why don't you tell us a little bit about that decision-making process and what kind of path you took for a while there?
Well, again, this is one of the reasons why I think from a mentoring perspective it's very important to have clear veridical conversations. I actually served on the Group DI committee as with the title of faculty associate as a graduate student. And had I fully understood at that point that was a real grooming process, I may have made somewhat different decisions. I really love the University of Michigan and what it was doing, and the environment, and certainly ISR. But there was no discussion about local job opportunities. And so my wife and I, who attained her PhD in linguistics here at the university, we both had to jointly find a job, and the only thing we could find locally was actually at Oakland University. And we both interviewed there and were offered positions at relatively low wages. And it just so happened that there was a graduate from the Michigan Social Psych program had come to visit a year before, and named Alan Kraut. And he's actually a contemporary of Pat Guerin. And so we had a conversation, and he invited me out to IBM. Great conversations, and this was a place that did survey research. And at that point, they had 408,000 employees that were surveyed on average every 18 months. So there were great opportunities to engage in the survey activity. The most impressive thing I found about IBM was I went out and visited, and within 5 days, I had an offer. And they had actually wanted me to stay longer on the interview trip, but I said, no, I need to go back. But they put this together very quickly, and it was a very good offer. So I went to IBM just on the tail end of finishing my dissertation. So I went there in September and ended up finishing the dissertation on a terminal with thermal paper over a phone line. They wanted to give me time off to finish the dissertation. I said no. I went to work every day, came home at night, and plugged away and did this dissertation. And on this very, very slow telephone line hooked back into the system here up on North Campus.
So this is at a stage where, just to get clear on the
Yep.
technology, because I think that's important. So you have a computer at home, and you're using sort of an early version of what is going to become the internet and facsimile transmission, and you basically have the computer hooked into a thing where you literally put the phone on.
You put it, yes, and coupled into basically what would be receiving earpieces, both the speaker and the sound piece. So yes.
So this was cutting edge technology at the time, and was it something that IBM was working on? Because I don't imagine people didn't just have this stuff in the early 80s.
No, people didn't just have this stuff. This was actually a terminal I brought from Michigan because recognized at that point IBM was basically large mainframe computing. They had mid-range computers and office products. So which you probably don't remember, the IBM's electric typewriter, very large, and they had some data masters and so on, but very much business machines for the office environment. And it really wasn't until, so this was the fall of 1981, and so it wasn't until December of 1981 that IBM actually introduced the IBM personal computer. Now there were other things like the TRS-80, known as the Trash 80. Apple had, a machine, but these weren't machines that you could really do productive business work with. So yeah, this terminal was just connected by phone with the data squawk, making the connection and so on, and doing that. So it was a very slow process.
And so as you wrapped up your dissertation, the kind of work that you did at IBM was?
So I'm glad you raised that, because some have the impression that I may have abandoned my keen interest in identity work. And in fact, I did not. I really took a look at the attitude and object. So I became very much interested in one's relationship with the group. And so that relationship with the group, you probably don't know what this is, but this is called an overhead. You know what an overhead is, all right. So IBM used to call them foils, but basically one of the first studies I conducted at IBM was taking a look at really trying to predict turnover behavior. And so that was predicated upon the notion of how strong the affinity was that the person had with the firm. So there's a range of these individual values that were really that kind of connection with the company. But notions about attitude toward the job, the satisfaction with it, and this whole notion about taking a look on the outside. So what were the alternatives? Because my dissertation was all about taking a look at the in-group and the out-group. And so this was, in a sense, a natural extension of that kind of work. And so we actually ended up predicting some turnover behavior among different types of engineers. And so we really had to change some of that work to strengthen the affinity toward the in-group. This work also got extended further when just that next year, in 1982, I did the first study of the executive population within IBM. So really surveyed a couple thousand top executives worldwide. And among that, really taking a look at a range of business issues and impact, but also doing things like predicting attrition. So again, it's the identity elements about how strong is the affiliation to the company versus leaving. And we actually made some very strong predictions as a result of that study. That's where one of these divisions where people actually left from, and that it was actually predicted. Also had very strong impact, again, using data, because we got folks who rose to the CEO position in IBM historically, and it probably still is the case today, actually came from what they called marketing. It was basically sales. So people who were most successful at selling certainly big iron and software. But the engineering side of IBM had never been represented. So as a result of this study that I conducted, Jack Keeler was actually appointed president of IBM. And I'm not sure there's been another president of IBM from the engineering ranks since then. But again, it just...
And what was the rationale for going engineering as opposed to...
Well, the rationale is actually having representation at the top of the organization, a voice, if you will, for the range of issues that affect the engineering community to help to produce better product. Because when you have a voice from the marketing side, they just tend to listen to marketing voices as opposed to the very important issues around engineering and development.
And so just a few statements just so that we can get a bit of a context.
Yep.
So things like organizational psychology and things like that, are they really around at this time?
Very, very good question. And so my interest actually as I got into the later stages of my graduate student career were really blending more around the organizational pieces. And I think had there been an appropriate blending, certainly with, I would have been at Michigan for 44 years.
Right.
But there was this position, certainly in psychology at that point, of taking a look at those organizational issues that were now kind of drifting more toward the business school. No, that is not, science. Whereas within ISR, we actually had a very, very strong group called CRUSC that was taking a look at the utilization of scientific knowledge. CRUSC stands for the Center for Research on the Utilization of Scientific Knowledge. And that was an organization that was really trying to understand a lot on the government side about why they don't make better utilization of the research that's done, but also in business organizations. And so for me, that kind of developed into more of a lifelong passion about how do you use this information to bring about change. And it was really the organizational change piece I was very much interested in. So the studies on the attrition, retention, it's about changing the environment in order to provide better working environments and greater stickiness for employees. And but yeah, there were actually some people doing that kind of work, but they tended not to be represented so much in ISR. And in fact, it kind of fell away, and the folks doing organizational behavior and change migrated, if you will, toward the business school.
Got it. And so I'm going to backtrack just a little bit
Yep.
here. If you could tell us a little bit more about how you end up being a faculty associate while you're still technically a graduate student. If you could tell us a little bit about that story and how that came about.
I don't know.
Okay.
I really do not know. All I know is I was appointed to this committee.
By who?
I'm not sure who, the memory's vague, but it was actually chaired by Doc Cartwright.
Okay.
And Doc Cartwright actually served as chair of my 619, which was kind of a prelim piece of research. And so I got to know Doc reasonably well then. And it was actually a marvelous opportunity to see Doc chairing a committee of people in social psych made up of people like Dick Nisbet and Gene Bernstein and Bob Zients, and a few others who were basically at that point kind of behaving as adolescents, but Doc brought them under control and conducted a very good meeting. So I learned a lot from Doc at that point. And also had conversations with Doc after he retired at an APA convention, and we had Yeah.
So rewind, I'm still back
Yep.
in this period here. So, all right, so you work on the NSBA training interviewers nationally. You focus really in on the racial identity questions. As you're putting together, you become convinced to use the data for your dissertation.
Yep.
You're thinking about doing something maybe a little different, or at least a different data set. As you come along at this point, it seems like a common theme in your work history has been organizations and organizing. So you organize a bunch of graduate students who I'm just guessing might have been a couple of years behind you or
Yep.
so, and you convince them of what and why.
Well, really convince them of the fact that, and this actually I think helped the National Survey of Black Americans in that, one, you don't want to stay around here forever. You need to get on with it, get done, and become productive in terms of your career. Because again, most of these folk are now edging past the 26, 27-year-old mark, right? So when you start going beyond that, you really need to be getting on with your career. And so it's not as if it really took convincing so much, but it's just a whole notion about organizing and let's talk through the process of getting this thing done.
So what do you think, why was it important to you? I mean, you were getting ready to be done and be just fine. What was important to you about reaching out to these folks? Did you have prior relationships with them? Or?
Well, these are all folks I've been working with for some since 1974 who had known. Most of them had known at least 3 or 4 years. Mm-hmm. So, and some of them, much longer than that. Mm-hmm. So it's a sense of an obligation to this group because, again, that's what the National Survey of Black Americans was all about, and it was this cooperative spirit and making sure that you lift people up with you. Mm-hmm. People who just had a single orientation, number one, did not join the group, and number two, had they joined, they wouldn't have been around there very long.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Very interesting. So now, we've covered up into your early career part.
Yep.
I want to come back and finish that. But I also want to make sure, you see I'm kind of slowly rewinding the tape
Yep.
a bit here. If you could talk to us a little bit about some of the particular challenges that you recall, especially during this period when you are, given your previous experience doing survey research prior to Michigan, prior to the NSBA, you end up doing a lot of the interview training. If there are any kind of stories that come to mind, I've heard stories about all kinds of interesting, challenging stories during this period when you're really sort of getting out there for the first time in the field in one way or another, talking
Right.
to people.
Well, one is, this is very unique in that we were going out and recruiting principally black interviewers. And these were black interviewers that we had to, and I should note that Letha Chadiha was very instrumental, certainly on that recruitment side, and she honchoed much of the kind of field operations. But she had the relationships with most of the interviewers, and we tried to appoint in each of the major centers a supervisor, if you will, who was going to try and stay closer to the immediate action of the day-to-day operations and to hand out the kind of interviews to individuals to make sure that they got done, follow up, and that kind of thing. So our real challenge there was, one, the initial identification, and we did a lot of churches and other kind of civic organizations in order to get the right people. And then once we had some folks identified and they understood what we're after, we then used them to kind of, if you will, snowball recruit. So we had usually full training sessions for that. We had attrition, which is why we had to go back to some locales to re-recruit. That was one piece. The second piece is the environments in which we were operating were, I'm not sure we could do this today because there were some environments that were starting to become fairly locked down, like in the Washington, D.C. area and some places in New York, where they're very hard to just get entree to a building. And so you had to do that in order to do the listing of the households and then the people who live within those. But we had to, train interviewers about how to do it, to be persistent in order to do the full listing, because you could not allow a household to go unlisted, right?
Absolutely. As you think back during that time, why don't you share a few moments of, particular excitement? At least we'll talk about the parties later. But as you, did you ever really realize what you were doing? Was there ever a moment during this period, right, where you really realized what this contribution is going to be?
Well, I think
excited about anything.
I think we were very much excited because we were doing something that had not been done certainly within ISR, and we had at least a vague understanding that there's no place else in the country that had kind of done this before. But again, you also have to recognize that many of the people involved in this process had been involved in lots of other firsts. I mean, may have been the first one from a family who either went to college, or a first who went to graduate school, or a first in that university who did X, Y, and Z. So there was a lot of kind of groundblazing, yes, trailblazing that had been done, very early on by many of these people. And so this was just, I think, just a continuation of that activity, certainly given much of the social unrest that we saw in the late 60s and into the 70s. So it was kind of a natural, and so we're going to do things differently. Yeah, and so, one other in particular situation of note in terms of the trials and tribulations of getting out there in the field is, recall we had picked up this huge, I think it was a 17 passenger van, Plymouth passenger van. Uses these very long things. It was a university, and so it had the emblem on the side. It was blue, and so we loaded it up with all of our training materials, questionnaires, and boxes and boxes of stuff. And so we headed off toward Chicago. We had a hotel downtown that we were going to, and where we were going to do the training. And I was driving, and we had, I can't remember all who was in the vehicle, but I know Linda Chatter was sitting in the seat behind me. I think Susan Mosley was in opposite her, and a couple of others. So we were going down the train. Got turned around a little bit and just wanted to pull off the highway to look, try and check for directions. Pulled off the highway, went underneath this overpass, and we're stopped at a light just past the underpass there, because the highway that went up, and heard this bang. And so looked around, and I just kind of looked around, and the glass in the window, right where Linda was sitting, was starting to fall out. So I quickly wheeled around the corner. And, about a block later, just stopped and says, everybody okay here? Right. And Linda was clearly shaken. Yeah. So quickly got back on the highway and just, got away. Mm-hmm. And so when we got to the hotel downtown, I said, well, I knew that for insurance purposes, I got to report this. And so I dialed 911. Mm-hmm. And for the next 2.5 hours, I was on hold with 911.
On hold?
I could not get through. So never ended up actually reporting this in the city of Chicago, but did when we got back. But that's one of those kind of scary things, but we persevered, went ahead and trained, and got it done.
Is this the rumored story of being shot at
in
Chicago?
Yes, this is the one. Yeah. And Linda got it very up close and personal.
Interesting. Wow. Okay, so it's also important, to talk about some of the more informal bonding activities that took place. And so we've talked with folks about basketball games leagues, intramural leagues, house parties, etc. Why don't you share with us some stories that you can recall from there, and also talk about how you think that affected the overall work at the still emerging PRBA?
Well, again, unlike many of the situations, environments today, people, I think, were much more connected in that we had picnics. And we were here year round, and folks got together certainly in the summer when we could. Picnics, basketball. In fact, we had, this was more kind of social psych, but we had a standing Saturday morning down at Burns Park. So, we played, ball every Saturday. And so we did that. There's other leagues that were, done during the fall down at the intramural building. So folks did that. There's also a group of us who did racquetball. And James had the opportunity to do some racquetball. He won't tell you how often he got beat. But Woody became very good, very, very good, such that he traveled on the circuit.
Oh, wow.
And he won, he probably has somewhere a whole bunch of trophies. But yeah, he got very good. And even his wife got good. And so that's, some of the things that we actually, did. So both athletically, socially, and there were also parties. The other thing that we also did was some of us, not all, but some of us, this is a kind of a topo map of Whitmore Lake. So we did fishing. So some of us fished, and so we knew exactly where the underwater structure was. And so this is a map from way back in the day that I actually utilized, went up to Whitmore Lake, got a boat, and as we say, we used to wet some line.
Data-driven fishing.
I did. I don't know if anybody else did. I know that I counted myself as, the 10% of the fishermen who got 80% of the fish. So,
right.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And do you feel like there was some relationship between all of these non-working activities and the quality and the nature of the actual work that got done?
I absolutely, I think so, because it really helped to facilitate the work getting done, because you recognize the personalities and the strengths of individuals and how to really forge through difficult situations and issues. It really did help as a result. So understanding the individuals much more deeply.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So we'll move back forward a little bit. I'm particularly interested in how you see kind of the PRBA today, right? So we've clearly made major contributions with the National Survey of Black Americans. And in fact, actually, let's talk a little bit about the NSAL and how that comes along. So people generally know it as a study that kind of follows on to the NSBA, but the story about how it comes along is still being put down to paper. So do you have any memories on how and why that study?
So I was actually out of here when the NSAL was being further developed, but much of the lineage of NSAL again started to kind of follow more the kind of funding stream, so the kind of issues that were current at that point, but also recognizing what elements of the original NSBA survey could be sunset. And so it was the morphing of that content. And one of the things that came along later was a deeper involvement in the political attitudes of Black Americans, and certainly more interest in other people of color.
So basically from 1981.
Yep.
When did you come back to ISR?
So I actually came back into ISR in 2008.
Okay. So then tell us a little bit about why you came back to ISR at that point, and a little bit about any kind of back and forth communication that might have occurred while you were at, I'm assuming still mostly IBM that time, during that time, and the work that you were doing.
Mostly IBM, but yeah, I had interns from the social psych program here in Michigan working with me at IBM. And again, I mentioned the importance of Osiris in the process of all the data that we had. Started really doing more work, again, keeping in the back of the head this notion about the role of identity. And social identity relative to the workplace, as well as social identity and its relationship to brands. And so I actually spent a couple decades doing the work around brands and reputation.
Wow.
And again, with the backdrop of the identity piece, because people actually wrap their arms around brands based upon the importance it plays to their identity, so their social identity. So always having that in mind, it was very important in understanding the lens through which people were moving toward or away from brands and products and services.
So your work in the corporate sector that was largely IBM included not only studies of the organization itself, but also you did field studies of potential customers.
Yes.
Okay. So
Yes.
you did like national studies or local or focus groups or what kind
All of those.
Okay.
All kinds of usually survey-based research of different segments, customer segments. And so from 1981 through the late 80s, IBM actually had a very strong presence in the low end of the market. So we had personal computers. So, and we had literally millions of those kind of in the homes and business environment. So that allowed for a much deeper understanding, because I also directed the research activity and the development of the IBM personal computer, second generation. And then went on to found a communications measurement body for IBM, which became very impactful and actually helped to lead to its turnaround in the early to mid 1990s. So it was extremely important work predicated upon some of the earlier work on identity.
Okay. So that is very interesting. So okay, so just to let you know, I know a little bit about IBM. So I do remember the AT and the XT.
Yep.
We had an XT in the home, you know, so I remember the products that were being sold during those days. Now, coming back towards your transition out of corporate, coming back to ISR. So what's going on? Why come back to ISR?
Well, so the transition is...
Anything else you want to fill in?
Yeah, so the transition clearly, one, rather than becoming a lifer at IBM, which, you know, many people had 35, 40 years, reached a point after the transition had actually, the turnaround had happened based in part upon the kind of research that I had put into place, not only in the U.S., but also around the world. So we understood different markets in their response to the kind of changes that we implemented. And again, that was basically from the marketing communications perspective. But as I was being asked to repeat research to which I already knew the answer. And in fact, after a couple of studies in which I predicted in advance within a couple of points where the study was going to come out, this was no longer of interest to me. So did a very active search in other environments and went and spent 3 years in financial services, and after that actually came back to Michigan to work for Ford. And that's where I started doing more of some of the product research. Still a lot on the product reputation side, but again, even more on the product and brand side. And did that for about 7 years in the combination of Ford and Chrysler. But again, living right here in Ann Arbor. So it was actually when coming back to Ann Arbor that it started to reforge the relationship with ISR. Did some corporate sponsorships with the program survey methodology. So started working on an external advisory committee, chaired that. So that started the...
All right, wait, slow down.
Yes.
So I've seen you recently made another position change, but you used to be in charge of corporate relations for ISR.
Yep.
So tell us a little bit about what that job is. You said something about sponsorship.
Yeah.
Give us a little more detail.
So when I was actually on the corporate side working for Ford and Chrysler, the program survey methodology was actually started in roughly 2002. Master's, PhD in survey methodology, kind of running in tandem with the Maryland program that was started by Bob Rose and others, principally to serve the Bureau of the Census and other statistical agencies, kind of more in the master sense. There's some PhDs there also. But it was really trying to bring people from the corporate side back into ISR, lots of different kinds of corporations. So I was there from Ford, but there are also people from research firms like Market Strategies, some small ones, and so on. But Mathematica was there at the table, and even people from government. But again, it's the whole notion about how do you help to train people effectively in survey research, and then provide both internship and job opportunities afterwards. And for me, it was always a question about ISR had always been producing lots of methodological innovations, and as I used to call it, there were lots of gems on the floor of ISR that people walk over every day and don't recognize as being very important innovations. So one of the things I wanted to make sure happened is to start to transfer some of this wealth of innovations to the outside, and thereby allow a transfer of wealth, of support, if you will, to the program for survey methodology. So that was the intent while I was on the corporate side, and then it was actually cemented when I decided that I had been making presentations in conferences for 2 to 3 years about the fact that the sky is falling, the auto industry is broke, we got legacy costs, this is becoming very unaffordable, and within a short period of time, this is all going to tumble on itself. And so one day I looked around at myself and said, you're probably speaking truth, and so it's better to leave now rather than when it actually does tumble. So I actually left a year before everything started happening in 2008. But so when I left, I actually took a little bit of time off, but then came back to work at ISR in 2008 to do corporate and foundation relations. So now I more formally was trying to cement the relationships with corporations to ISR, both for the program for survey methodology and doing other kinds of research on a sponsored basis.
Okay. All right. So during this time, for example, would this be one of the activities you might do? A particular corporation might have some kind of interest in some kind of survey research project. Would you build a relationship with the ISR, maybe a faculty member or graduate students to help them do that kind of study? Is that part of what you did?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. And most of it was survey-based, but there were a few things where we started to do some methodological innovations. So using the design seminar, which is part of the program in survey methodology, bringing in potential clients to say, here's a thorny methodological issue we have. and having students actually work on that in subgroups and come back and respond. And I actually did that when I was at Chrysler, and utilized that and did an experiment in one of our automotive clinics to try and understand how we could literally save hundreds of thousands of dollars in research costs by presenting our products differently and in a way that didn't require our design studio to build prototypes. So, yeah.
Wow. Okay. All right. And so, so you have this relationship. You're bringing first. You take academia to industry.
Yep.
And then you bring industry back to academia in a nice circle form.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us a little bit about how you see the market for organizations like PRBA? So there are increasingly throughout the nation various centers that are being created to study black folks in various ways.
Mm-hmm.
Not all of them, I don't know how many of them there are that are survey based, but if you could just say a little bit about how you see the PRBA today in this kind of knowledge market.
Well, I think there's a very great opportunity in that, as you know, the demographics of this country are changing dramatically, both from an age perspective as well as from a racial ethnic perspective. And the age piece is one that PRBA, while at one point in the past we had a major strength there, we've not done so much of late. But I think that's one that we could actually come back to and re-strengthen, because we as a population are getting much older every day. And we need to pay particular attention to the specialized issues of the underrepresented minorities in this process, both from a health perspective as well as the ability to access lots of opportunities, including healthcare. That's one. Two is there's a fundamental change and shift happening economically at the lower tiers of age. And no longer will they be able to, I think, retire. And there are many people who are on, kind of that retirement bubble now who are rethinking exactly when they can actually do that. But this notion about lifelong work and retraining for lifelong work, I think, is going to be something extremely important. We're going to have to recalibrate that whole thing. And I think the folks in PRBA, from a culture perspective, can help to recast that in very meaningful ways in terms of how work is done and where it is done and why it is done. So I think we need to take a look at a broader spectrum of those issues than we have looked at historically.
Mm-hmm. And let me just look at my cheat sheet.
Yeah.
Take a quick break, so do some check costs here. All right, so just to retread a little bit here, so we actually did really well covering the PRBA period.
Yep.
And a little bit about the NSBA. But if you could tell us about what you know about the actual consolidation of what actually became the PRBA. What was your perspective on it during that time?
Right.
The things that were going on.
So I actually came back in about 2010 to do work for PRBA, actually in developing a strategic plan. And that work allowed me to go out and conduct one-on-one in-person interviews with a range of people, probably in excess of 35 people, staff, current associates of PRBA, as well as former board members and so on. And a couple of very important things emerged, and one of which was PRBA is a gem that is hard to replicate anywhere else. The data, the knowledge, and experiences embodied in the organization should be protected and actually, I'm not going to say put on a pedestal, but certainly there should be broader access to those resources. A second very important piece came out, and that is many of the folks who've been steadfast in PRBA are of the what I would call the aging cohort. And as such, we should really think about them as aging out here in the next several years. Not that they won't be productive in terms of research activity, but they will no longer be the key drivers from an organizational perspective. So there really does have to be the passing of the guard leadership on to a younger generation. And that's a piece that most corporate organizations have some trouble with, let alone a not-for-profit and an academic organization. So that's one that has to be forcefully focused upon. Otherwise, you end up with an organization that kind of just falls under its own weight. I would hate to see that happen. So we actually have to have a range of younger folk become very deeply engaged and actively seek to rebuild that infrastructure. The other important piece around this is it's not that the social models of old have to be re-witnessed, but I think there's a lot about the old ways that have to be part and parcel of the PRBA going forward, and that is this notion of a common good, a common sense of working for the studied populations, and those populations under study have to get better as a result of the work of the PRBA, because it does not benefit the researcher if the populations aren't advanced. So that's one of the other major things that we have to make sure gets witnessed moving forward. And again, the other thing here is what came out very strongly as I put together this strategic plan is the need, as soon as we can, to actually come together to celebrate what has been the history of PRBA, and very importantly, to record as much of that history as possible so that it can survive individuals.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Let me see on the strategic planning thing. So what do you think are the things that need to be put into place in the next year, in the next 2 years, in order to kind of begin to address some of the things? So, for example, James is coming back, or he's at least leaving the directorship.
Right.
And it's likely that he's going to become more active in some of the things that are going on at the PRBA. But it seems like it's a potentially good time for folks to really be active on this next stage planning. So what are some of the things that you think need to happen, given your experience?
Again, one I've already mentioned, that is the re-engagement of a cadre of younger people. Absolutely necessary. Two is there has to be the identification of some different funding sources, because all of these, organizational and intellectual advances have come as a result of some infusions of monies that have allowed people to actually collect data, write findings up, and to publish. So there has to absolutely be the latter, and certainly it's going to have to come from the former. And that's going to be absolutely essential. The other thing I would say that even though people like James and Woody and Robert might be around, they should not be the folks in the lead roles. That has to go on to a younger cadre of PRBAers.
It's a question here. What are some of the suggestions for potential PRBA partners and collaborators at this stage?
Well, I think that number one, we have, in terms of time and space, we're in a unique place to do some work around health disparities. And there is sufficient funding at this point coming from the medical side who aren't social science based. And I think that's an excellent partnership. We just put together a grant from the medical school, U54, around mentoring. We'll see if that one gets funded, but even if it isn't, there are parts of that, of the cores, that could be pulled apart for R01 funding. And I think some excellent opportunities to work in collaboration with PRBA to get those things done. ISR and PRBA should take full advantage of the new wing and the biospecimen storage facility in the basement. We need to be training our folk on how you actually do that. So the notion of cortisol and, we need to be understanding exactly how you conduct that work and the meaning and impact of it.
So what do you think are some of the strengths and weaknesses of the PRBA? Over the years, and when you talk about those, if you could talk about what that means for today.
Well, again, the strengths have always been collaboration, cooperation. That's been at its core, and it's been one that has helped see the organization through both times of plenty and times of lean. And it's been that type of an orientation that I think has allowed the organization to actually continue. Very few organizations within ISR, given the level of funding that it has had, would be able to actually maintain. The other important strength of PRBA is actually the network. And so one of the things we're trying to get done this year is to really articulate what that network is, starting from the early days, how that has grown out, the connection points among people, and importantly, ideas. So that is a tremendous strength, and the degree to which we can actually demonstrate that, I think, will be a further strength. We recognize it because we know who to call at different points in time, but yeah.
But
documenting it, yes, yes.
So, I've been hanging around at the PRBA now for about a year. It's coming up soon. And I've been a part of a lot of different meetings, and I've seen a lot of different figures that we've talked about today in various capacities. And one thing that strikes me as really unique is this sense of family that is present. There are oftentimes disagreements, there are frustration points, and it seems like it took a lot of work to create that kind of, vibe, if you will. And as a younger person, it's rare to get enough folks together to be able to have that vibe. And the reason why I bring that up is because I see that as a core strength of the PRBA.
Mm-hmm.
And as you go about bringing in young folks, how do you also maintain that kind of family sensibility of doing business?
Well, that's an extremely tough question, certainly answering it for the young folk. But what's happened for many of the older folk in that generation is not only were they together, but they've seen their kids kind of grow up. So there are points of connection, and understanding those and where they've gone off, I think, helps to maintain that sense of, if you will, family. Mm-hmm. Folks will go and visit one another, lots of different places. And, it's not unusual for, even though you haven't seen someone for 7 or 8 years, to kind of basically pick up from, where you were. But you gotta, it starts with kind of day one, because it's unfortunate that the overall academic culture has kind of grown to the point where it's either me or you.
Yeah.
And what I get, the more I get means the less you get.
Right.
And that's not the cooperative way.
Right.
And so the notion about having to have a certain number of first authored publications, right,
Yeah.
sets that in motion.
Yeah, it certainly is in many ways a different day than it was
Yep.
before on that score. So, as you know, the funding matrix is a little bit different today than it has been over the years. So it looks like if a soft money place like PRBA is going to really thrive in the future, we've got to get more diversified in terms of the funding streams that we rely upon. So in addition to federal streams and foundations, it's going to become increasingly important for us to draw upon individual donors or even smaller foundations. So you might think about Ford as a foundation, but there might also be smaller foundations that give smaller dollar amounts.
Yep.
If you were trying to explain the value of PRBA to someone in that area, in that realm of doing business, what's in it for them? What is it? What is the story because for an academic, you've laid out a lot of the good stuff. But for a person who doesn't do survey research, doesn't read journal articles, what's the value of the PRBA?
So, again, when you think about foundations, the value to them is really about helping to advance their mission, their cause. So it's going to really depend on what they're trying to achieve. It may be increased educational levels for, children of color in urban environments, below a certain socioeconomic range. So it really is going to depend on the ability of PRBA to say, we can help you do or achieve that. I think there may actually be even greater opportunity with some corporations. And corporations many of whom I frankly believe will be caught with their pants down as we actually do this huge demographic shift, not understanding the future customers and why they think and behave the way they do. I think PRBA has a lot to offer in that regard, not to sell out, to say, you need to do this, but actually I think there's a quid pro quo. And the quid pro quo here is you help us to fund some very important research in understanding these communities. We can help you to understand how to make products that actually respond to their needs. And it's the needs piece that I think can then take out some of the sting of actually working with some of the companies. And I think there are many who are actually, from a social responsibility perspective, would be willing to do that because they know that they're achieving a couple of ends in the same regard.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So at this point, I'm at the anything else stage. We've pretty much knocked out, in one way or another, most of these questions here. But if you can think of other things that you'd like to have sort of on the record as we put together this mashup of interviews and stuff.
Well, I also think that what's important for folks who've taken alternative paths is that there's also been a lot of mentoring that has happened. Over the course of the last 25, 30 years, there haven't been many, but the ones there have been have actually been very strong relationships. And that is mentoring people into certainly the marketing research realm. I've had folks who've been master's level people who have been trained in psychology. Most of them have been, not at a PhD level, but at a master's level. Some have had MBAs. Actually had a faculty member from with a PhD from Princeton and from the faculty at Cornell, who's come in, and I've taught her, and she's now a director in a corporation. I've had other women who I've actually mentored who went on to become fellows at Intel, and this was the first non-engineer Intel fellow. And so, I stay in touch with a range of these folks. There aren't many, but, they're kind of closely held.
Yeah, yeah. So, just a random question. Have you sat on folks' dissertation committees? I can imagine, especially some of the interns that you brought in, maybe as they matriculated along. Have you done any kind of dissertation work? Or?
I have done some work with people who are doing their dissertations, but I've not been on their committees. Was close at one point, but this was a student who was having lots of issues in convening an appropriate committee. But yeah.
Sure. Yeah. So another question that comes to mind is, I imagine the way of doing business in academia is very different from the way of doing business when there's profits to be made, shareholders to satisfy. What do you think are some of the ways that the research community, in particular PRBA, survey research, soft money community, what are some of the values or orientations to work that you think might translate from the corporate side into research governance?
Y'all need to get rid of this thinking about no-cost time extensions.
Explain that to us.
Just the basic notion that somehow I got a grant to execute some research. I didn't get it done in that time frame. I still promise to do it, but I'll do it at a later point. So you keep pushing, that thing off. Well, the fact of the matter is, you need to get it done when you said you were going to get it done. Why? Usually you've paid staff to do that. And so that means you have to scramble to get some other dollars to kind of fill that void later. Two is, in the process, you also need to make sure that you appropriately characterize what it will cost in order to do the work you say it's going to do. Because when you kind of underbid that just leads to all of those issues of your inability to get it done. So you need to do some very rigorous work around getting the work done when you say it is, because that allows you to do other new work later on. Two, when you cost it appropriately, you pay people for the work that's being done, and you're going to be a lot more productive. I mean, that is just simple being prudent with the money.
With the money is a
Yes,
major.
Right.
So just a random thought. I mean, in some ways, there's an opportunity somewhere within ISR for something like a research accounting part of the training that academics don't get, right? So you don't get training at any point in how to manage these essentially they're small entrepreneurial businesses.
Well, it's actually, one is the research process. So making sure you fully understand the research process and what it will take in order to execute each phase of that is number one. Two is, what does it cost in order to execute each phase of that? Three, how do you actually monitor the cost along the way to ensure that it's going to come in both on time and on budget? Absolutely.
Okay, absolutely. So before I ask this next question, any other tidbits that you might have found yourself sitting in a meeting or doing a particular task at the ISR and thought to yourself, these folks could benefit from this thing that I learned in corporate America?
I know the Academy prides itself on the notion that everybody has a vote. Sometimes you can get a lot more done if you have faith in someone. Just simply having faith and allowing that person to say, this is the way we're going to do it, allows progress to be made. That is one of the things I learned from Doc Cartwright.
All right. That's a good nugget. So as we sort of wrap up, and again, I'm not under any time pressure. So anything that comes to mind, feel free. But you talked a little bit about the need to think about the future of the PRBA and doing some transition stuff and trying to find a cadre of folks who are committed to the PRBA and its mission, et cetera, and so forth. If you had, say, 10 people in this room who had been recruited from the most promising graduate programs in some of the best departments, interdisciplinary departments throughout the country, and these were the folks that were going to go ahead and charge forward, along keeping your, the advice piece there. But what would you have to say? What do you think are the important things to say to that young group of leaders?
One is really having one another's back. Two is actually working on behalf of the populations under study, making sure that at the end of the day, after all the academic rigor that's been applied, that you actually have something that to say to change in a positive way the lives of those that you've actually had under study. So it's a combination of intervention policy stuff. If it's not leading to that, you have to ask the question of why. Two is, I think, really thinking much more creatively about how you get some of this work done. From a funding perspective, how you collect the data, the information. There are a range of alternative methods for helping to inform the problem or issue. To do it in some very unique and creative ways. You don't have to always do it in the way in which it's been done. And then four is, I'd say, you need to have fun at it. Because in the old days, whether we wanted to or not, we had fun.